All right, so you're driving down the road, man, you're cruising, it's a Sunday, it's a nice day, you're in your Corvette, and then you look down at the temperature gauge and you realize, man, I'm running like 230. Is this thing overheating? What do I do? Don't panic. I've been there. Let's talk about it. I'm just going to tell you right out the gate, man, the Corvette C6s, have a tendency to run warm. I've been on a lot of forums. I've driven this Corvette, and oftentimes I've seen guys post where they're hitting temperatures of 230 plus, and they're like, man, what is going on? I'm a little worried this car's running warm. Well, it's okay. There's a few things to know about the Corvette C6. Number one, it has a tendency to run warm. If you live in Arizona or Texas or in the South and you're in the blazing heat, this thing might get 230 degrees. It really might. That's on a stock cooling system, and that's why it's important. If you've got a Corvette C6, you want to upgrade that stock radiator. Now, there's a couple different options for the radiator upgrade. There's the DeWitt's radiator, which is the one I highly recommend, but that thing's $1,000. It's not cheap. There's a couple other radiator manufacturers. I cannot recall the name, but you can get them for around $300, $400. They're all aluminum. They're supposed to be pretty decent, and honestly, the reviews aren't bad on them. So if you want to save a couple bucks, look up one of those, but I definitely recommend upgrading the radiator on one of these cars. Now, here's the thing. Just because the car is running warm, I'm not saying go out and spend money on a radiator or anything like that. These cars are very temperamental, no pun intended, when it comes to cooling efficiency. And what I mean by that is that one of the biggest issues that happens in the Corvette C6 is air gets stuck in the coolant system, and I see that happen all the time. And as a matter of fact, the reason I'm shooting this video because it just happened to this one right here. The reason these cars are very prone to getting air trapped in the system and preventing good coolant flow within that system. And so there's a few things you can do, man. If your Corvette C6 is running warm, before you go out and buy a radiator and do all this other stuff, there's a couple things you can do. Number one, go ahead and replace the thermostat. Now, a lot of guys will say go with the 160 thermostat. These cars come with the thermostat that's for 187 degrees. That's from the factory. I would recommend sticking with the 187 thermostat. Some guys say go with the 160. The thing about a 160 degree thermostat is, yes, it's going to open up the coolant system earlier, but you need to allow that coolant system to actually warm up to a sufficient temperature so the oil can lubricate properly, you know? So yes, it can start running the fluid through the system at 160 degrees, but you want that fluid to be warmed up before it circulates. But the engines need to be up to a certain operating temperature to lubricate efficiently. So that's the main takeaway from that, is that you can go with the 160 thermostat, but your car's not going to be warming up to the optimal temperature, and that can hurt some of the lubrication mechanics, I guess, for lack of a better term. So yeah, if your car's running warm, first thing I'd start off with, man, is honestly, I would check and see if there's any air in the system. And there's a few things you can do. Let's check it out real quick. All right, guys, I'm just going to tell you the method I use just to try and get the air out the system. I just removed the cap from this overflow tank, and then I pulled off this hose that goes to the overflow tank. I put a funnel in here, and then I just put a 50-50 mix of Dex Cool. You always got to use Dex Cool with these, and then 50% water. So I would just pour it, and then I would get a little bit of feedback in here. I would get some air bubbles out, and then I would crank it up, and I would run the car for around 30 seconds to 2 minutes, revving it up, turn on the heater on full blast, keep doing that, and eventually it'll push all the air out and the coolant will get circulated. Here's the thing, man, one of the easiest diagnostic things to do with the Corvette is replacing the thermostat. You know, when you're looking at the coolant system, trying to figure out coolant issues, the thermostat is super easy to replace on these bad boys. I would get a factory 187 thermostat, and let me show you how to replace the thermostat. It's super easy. All right, guys, so we'll start from the top. We'll just go right here to the thermostat. That's the thermostat housing right there. You can see one 10mm bolt right there, and then another 10mm on the other side. It's these two bolts. You can probably replace the thermostat without actually having to take off this hose, but if you do want to take off this hose, just know that this thermostat housing, it goes down pretty far, so you've got to remove this hose pretty far to get off the thermostat housing. But the thermostat, super simple to replace on these cars. Two 10mm bolts. Thermostat's about 20 bucks. Not bad at all. All right, so I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but the main thing about this video is just to talk to you about how to figure out how to diagnose your Corvette C6 if it's starting to overheat on you. Here's the thing, if it's starting to massively overheat, make sure you don't have any leaks. And if you've still got coolant in the system, check the thermostat. The thermostat's pretty easy to change. Go from there. Now, if you do any kind of work on the coolant system, like changing the thermostat, you're gonna need to bleed the air out the system, and bleed the air out the system using that method that I described earlier, and that's by removing the overflow cap, taking that hose, putting a funnel in it, filling it from there, letting the bubbles kind of gurgle out, running the car, turning on the heat, and then that'll eventually circulate all the air through the system. When I did this car, it took me probably 3 or 4 rounds of doing it. They're very temperamental when it comes to air in the system, so do that and that should take care of it. If you've made sure there's no air in the system, if you've replaced the thermostat, if your radiator doesn't have leaks, you've probably got a bad water pump if it's still overheating on you. So those water pumps, they're not that bad. They're not that expensive. I mean, you can get one for about 160 bucks online, and they're not terribly hard to replace. Here's the good thing about the Corvette C6. The Corvette C6, honestly, it's pretty easy to work on, man. I've got a BMW. That thing is an absolute nightmare. But the LS engine, that is one of the beautiful things about the LS. They're relatively user-friendly, and there's so many forums and videos to help you walk through the process. Almost anyone can do basic maintenance to these cars. Bottom line, man, the Corvette C6, it runs warm. I mean, the low temp fans don't cut on until I think 220, and then the high temp fans cut on at like 230. So that baby's cooking at that point, but it's just a warm running car. But if you live somewhere where the heat gets crazy, like here in Atlanta, man, I get it. You're gonna need to upgrade the coolant system on this thing. Otherwise, it's gonna run up to 230 and you're gonna be panicking a little bit. I get it, I was doing the same thing. All right, so let's just do a quick recap on the coolant system of the Corvette C6. Number one, the Corvettes, they like to run a little warm. So if your Corvette gets over 220, closer to 230, if you're in like some big time heat, don't panic. That's just what they do. Number two, when it comes to diagnosing the Corvette C6, one of the easiest things to replace is the thermostat. It's 2 10-millimeter bolts, get 187 degrees thermostat. You can do the 160. I recommend going with the 187, but that's up to you. Number two, if you got to go as far as a water pump, they're not crazy expensive. They're not hard to replace. Number three, one thing I recommend for every Corvette C6 owner is upgrading from that factory radiator. I went with the DeWitt's radiator on this car. It runs at least 10 degrees cooler, man. And then last but not least, the Corvette C6, it is very temperamental when it comes to getting air in the system. And when that happens, man, the car is going to fluctuate. Like this car, for example, it had some air in the system one time, and it would go like 220 sitting fine, then it would go to 230, drop back 220, 210, and it was bouncing around a little bit, and it fluctuated so much. I'm like, okay, there's definitely got to be air in the system. And so I did the method I described, where I just pulled the cap off of the overflow tank, I pulled the hose, I put a funnel in there, and I just filled up the radiator like that. So, and that also pushed air out the system. Remember, you got to run your car, turn the heat on, let the coolant flow through the heater core. That reaches the highest point of the vehicle from the lowest point, gets all that air out. Rev it up a little bit, because if you rev it up a little bit, that's going to move some of the air out and all that too. So, yeah, and you might have to do it 3 or 4 times. So that's pretty much it, man. I just want to make a quick video because honestly, I just changed the thermostat on this thing last night, and I know that the Corvette C6 is just leaving summer. I've seen so many posts about how warm they are running. I just want to make a quick video giving you a couple little tips, a couple things to think about. Radiator upgrades, how to change the thermostat, you know, water pump prices, some, you know, getting the air out the system type procedures. Just a couple little tips to help you out, man. Either way, man, I appreciate you guys watching. If you like Corvette C6s, check out some other Corvette C6 videos, man. Appreciate you guys watching. We'll see you on the next one. Here's the thing, man. These cars are pretty temperamental. They really are. And what I mean by that is they're very, air gets trapped in the, adding a new thermostat. And so an easy,